So we're starting now. Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta and distinguished panelists, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the special session on Future of Democracy in South Asia by Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified or understood and conflicts are prevented or resolved. NICE has hosted some of the eminent policymakers, leaders, public intellectuals, such as Noam Chomsky, John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, Barry Bujan, and several others in last 1 year. I think this session is really important as there is rising conservatism in South Asia and in the region. Though there is increase in number of political parties, there is decline in terms of ethos, functioning, and programs. The role of religious parochialism in politics has substantially increased in Bangladesh, Nepal, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. In spite of the democratic institutions, elected governments, local governments, democratic institutions, democracy and democratic culture is still far from becoming the norm. To talk on these aspects, we have invited Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta needs no introduction, but as a custom, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta is a former Vice-Chancellor of Ashoka University. He was previously president at Center for Policy Research. He has been a professor at Harvard, Jawaharlal Nehru University, the Global Faculty Program at NYU Law School. He has published widely in political theory, constitutional law, society and politics in India, governance and political economy, and international affairs. His most recent publications include the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution, co-edited with Madhav, Khosla, and Sujit Choudhary, Rethinking India's Public Institutions with Devesh, Kapur, and Milan, Vaishnav, Non-Alignment 2.0 with Srinath Raghavan, Sunil Khilnani, and others, the Oxford Companion of Politics in India with Niraja Jayal, India and Multiculturalism with Bruce Jones and WPS Sidhu, and The Burden of Democracy. Mehta has also served in a number of policy roles, including member convener of the Prime Minister of India's National Knowledge Commission, member of the National Security Advisory Board, member of the Lyngdoh Committee, and he chairs the jury of the Holberg Prize. Mehta has a prolific engagement with public affairs. He's an editorial consultant at Indian Express, where he writes a regular column. In addition, he has written for the Financial Times and a number of leading national and international publications. He is on the editorial board of American Political Science Review and Journal of Democracy. I'm sure all our audience are eager to listen to Professor Mehta, so I will not stand between our audience and Professor Mehta. Professor Mehta, we're really honored to have you with us. We'd like to request you to make your initial remarks in 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. This session is streaming live on Facebook and several of other pages. We'd like to request all our audience to drop their questions under the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat room. Professor Mehta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. First of all, congratulations to NICE for putting together really an extraordinary program. I mean, I think, there are very few events in South Asia that kind of match the range that you have brought together, and it's very much a privilege to be part of this program. Dr. Jaiswal kindly asked me to sort of ruminate, and I think ruminate is the right word here. I'm not going to present a finished paper in the conventional sense of the term on the future of democracy in South Asia. And as you can imagine, it's a trap. I mean, there's an old Sufi saying that he who speaks about the future lies even when he's speaking the truth. So I'm not sure I can provide a crystal ball gazing into the future. But I will offer some reflections on the state of democracy in contemporary South Asia. I'll try and touch upon South Asia as a whole, but obviously, the bulk of my remarks will come in some senses from the Indian experience. But I think the Indian experience will find resonance in thinking about South Asia. So let me begin with a quotation. Actually, I was reminded of this quotation just this morning. I thought it'd be a perfectly appropriate way to begin. This is from Justice William O. Douglas, who was Justice of the American Supreme Court. He once wrote, and I think this quotation captures this moment quite wonderfully. As nightfall does not come at once, neither does oppression. In both instances, there is a twilight when everything remains seemingly unchanged. And it is in such twilight that we must all be aware of change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of darkness. And I think it's fair to say that South Asia is currently in that twilight zone as far as democracy is concerned. At a formal level, nothing much seems to have changed. Most of our countries are still robust electoral democracies. At least in countries like India, elections are still a religion. People care about them, people participate in them. The protocols and rituals, participatory and political rituals of democracy seem alive and well. And yet, right, it's very hard to shake off the sense that we may be in a twilight zone as far as democracy in South Asia is concerned. On every measure of what constitutes a democracy, South Asia has, for the most part, been regressing. The latest VDEM scores on India basically remind us that India is now roughly comparable to where it was in 1975, 1977, which was the last time it had a formally declared state of emergency. And even if you take these scores with a pinch of salt, as we must, I mean, there are problems with these indexes. There is no question that on almost every important dimension of the democratic experience, we are entering a new twilight zone. What are its symptoms in a country like India? But I can urge all South Asian participants to think of their own country and think of the parallel to tick off. I mean, you don't need somebody from outside to tell you. Majoritarianism. There is no question that India is on its way to becoming a majoritarian ethnocracy. That's the term of art that is in some senses that is used these days. What does that mean? That means that law and politics are an instrument of majoritarian power and seek to establish the primacy of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism as, in a sense, the cultural identity, the legal identity of India. And the manifestations of this are, I think, apparent in a whole series of laws and measures. The Citizenship Amendment Act. Nobody in India in the right minds is against creating a pathway for citizenship for refugees from all our neighboring countries, right? But it was completely needless to frame a law in a way that in some senses excluded the possibility of giving members of particular religions citizenship through that pathway. Laws relating to conversion, laws regulating intermarriage. I mean, these are just sort of random examples. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi officiated, did the Bhumi Pujan for the temple at Ayodhya, he said quite remarkably that that day was going to be at least as, if not more important in India's history than 15th August. This was the recovery of a 1,000-year freedom struggle. These are his words, not mine, right? So clearly, in some senses, that majoritarianism is becoming common sense, and it's being slowly but surely inscribed in law and legal practice. Okay. There is the obvious fact, second, of the erosion of civil liberties. Again, India's record and the record of all our democracies and all our polities, to put it mildly, has never been perfect. But India, India used to pride itself on having more checks and balances. Many of the laws, admittedly, that are being used to abridge civil liberties, preventive detention laws, sedition laws, have been used by governments in previous times. But I think now they are reaching a level of, I think, impunity and arbitrariness, which is unprecedented, at least in recent times. There is the erosion of checks and balances. The Indian Supreme Court used to pride itself on being the most powerful court in the world. It was kind of setting a precedent for itself, right? Or a precedent for other democracies on, how judicial power can, in some senses, be an extraordinary force in a democracy. For most practical purposes, the Supreme Court has abdicated its responsibilities to the Indian Constitution over the last 7 to 10 years. It has refused to hear civil liberties cases in time. It has refused to adjudicate on important constitutional matters pertaining to federalism, Article 370 abrogation, Kashmir. You can name it. And by and large, overall, it is basically acting as a supplicant of executive power in a way that we have not seen since 1975, 1977, right? The Election Commission of India, still, I think Indian elections are free, but increasingly, there are slight question marks over the fairness of the electoral process and some of the Election Commission's rulings. So checks and balances declining. Federalism, right? A source of friction in almost all of our polities in different forms, right? The Indian federal settlement, which for the most part, some exceptions, Kashmir and till recently the Northeast, apart, had actually worked quite well in terms of a fiscal arrangement, a political arrangement, an administrative arrangement that could knit together this diverse polity. This federalism is coming under increasing strain. Power has been centralized to an unprecedented degree. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, even more important than all the things that I've said, is a certain kind of corrosion of civil society. It's hard to capture, I think, the range and nature of political discourse and social discourse that almost all our countries are facing, right? Some kind of communal and ethnic poison is becoming second nature and common sense to our civil societies. It is being legitimized by the political class. The pathways to political success are through the exercise of some kind of ethnic vigilantism in one form or the other, right? And the sheer legitimation of prejudice and hate is of the levels that at least I have not seen in India, not even at the height of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement in the 1980s. But you can say the same of Pakistan. You can actually say the same of Bangladesh, to be very honest. You can say the same of Sri Lanka and Nepal in different ways. It's only a matter of degrees, right? And India, there's one more added complication, which is, again, I think by and large shared by most of our neighbors, which is an unprecedented attempt by the state to control the nature of the information order, right? Superficially, Indian media is formally free, right? And certainly if you read English language newspapers, and those are the only things you read, you probably get the impression, there's a lot of contestation, a lot of sort of anti-government commentary. But the brute fact is that the subtle and subtle control, particularly over broadcast media, large sections of the print media, at least large sections of the print media that politically matter, and the increasingly partisan regulation of social media, right, suggests new attempts to control a kind of information order in a democracy that is, again, unprecedented. So you put all of this package together, right? And again, think of your own different countries in some ways. And it's very hard to shake off the impression that South Asia is in fact entering a sort of new twilight zone of democracy. Dr. Jaiswal mentioned the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution. These days, I have to tell students in class, I don't know what the Indian Constitution is anymore. The Constitution has entered a kind of twilight zone as we, in a sense, continue with these rituals and facades of a liberal democracy. Now, why is all of this happening? And can this be combated? Can this be overturned in some ways? I'm afraid in the time available, I hope we can take some of this up in question. I don't have much to offer, but I think one has to, in a sense, take a slightly longer historical view of this. In the Indian case, I can give you some proximate causes. There's the obvious fact of the dissolution of the center and left parties, which have imploded on account of their own weaknesses and compromises with plutocracy. I mean, the Congress looks like a doddering, ancient regime, that we are desperately trying to kick into life. There is the obvious fact, in some ways, that I think the economic prospects for South Asia as a whole, Bangladesh has done relatively well in the last 4 or 5 years, but for South Asia as a whole, the kind of optimism we had over the last 10, 15 years, particularly in India, 2003 to 2009, 7, 8 years of 8% growth, right? Even if the growth was unevenly distributed, even if the employment elasticity was not what you wanted it to be, right? At least gave everybody the confidence, in some senses, that our future was going to be better than the past. But if you look at the results of the pandemic, it's for the first time in almost a generation that the middle class is shrinking, that people are actually going to fall back into poverty. Yes, it's a temporary shock, but it's a temporary shock that's going to have enduring effects in some senses. There's the realignment around caste in India, where for many years, we used to think that the logic of caste divisions, right, in some senses acts as a check and balance on the consolidation of Hindutva majoritarianism. This is a kind of cross-cutting cleavage that prevents the consolidation of majoritarian power. Caste no longer operates that way in Indian politics. I'm not saying caste is not a factor in Indian politics, but the logic of caste can now be easily, in a sense, assimilated within the modern kind of Hindutva project for reasons we can discuss. So I can give you a lot of proximate causes, but I think it is worth stepping back from the immediate present. And I'm going to go out on a limb. This is because this is a gathering of colleagues from South Asia, not from India. Is that we really have to look at the kind of longer arc of South Asian history, the last 7,500 years. Because what I see happening in South Asia is actually a replay of the 1930s and 1940s. Okay? 1930s, India had this tremendous national movement. Even though there were lots of forces not part of the national movement in the Congress, they all spoke a certain kind of language of civic constitutionalism. There were these negotiations over power sharing, right? How is representation going to be organized in independent India? Almost every protagonist in that debate used to take the kind of strategic, let's say, identity of the subcontinent for granted, that the cultural flows will continue to exist and so forth. And yet, in the space of 15 to 20 years, right, South Asia went from this incredibly promising anti-colonial movement to something that ended up in the horrors of partition, right? Why does contemporary South Asia remind me of the 1930s? You pick up any issue in India or in Pakistan, right? It's actually the same kind of politics and the same framing of our political identities that led to the Holocaust of partition. In India, I pick up a paper from contemporary India and I look at news from the late 1930s. What were they all talking about in the late 1930s? Fear of conversion, right? Demographic explosion of minorities, love jihads, right? Conversion, reconversion, vigilantism around cow protection, right? So one thing India needs to ask is, how come our politics as the 1930s feel to it? But it's not just in some sense India's problem, right? The fact of the matter is, if you look at South Asia, you don't have to just refer to the kind of contemporary Afghan crisis, but the fact that states of our region still do not have an ideological commitment to the pacification of violence, right? The first kind of condition of any civilized existence or any sort of liberal project, right? Most of our states are still not committed as ardently to the pacification of violence as they should, right? There were complex causes that led to the kind of horrendous violence that we saw in South Asia in 1947, right? And obviously there's no point kind of repeating that. But I think the interesting question is whether particularly both India and Pakistan, but what applies to India and Pakistan applies in different measures to Bangladesh and Sri Lanka as well, have actually learned the lessons. These are two separate nation states, proud, and of course will defend their interests. But the fundamental conundrum about South Asia, right? This is a fork in the road. Do we want to keep re-embracing the logic of partition and reproduce it generation after generation in each of our countries in new and different forms against other groups? Or do we want a radical rethinking of what South Asia can be, what the nation states of South Asia put together can do? And the choice simply is this, right? This is really what I ended, which is identities matter to all of us, right? As human beings, as citizens, as members of particular nation states, as members of particular ethnic communities, identities matter, okay? But we are creating polities which are characterized by what I would call the tyranny of compulsory identities, right? Where each identity is being benchmarked by particular configurations of power. In Pakistan, it's an Islamic state formally, so who's a good Muslim? Who can count as a Muslim? Why can't Ahmadiyyas count as full citizens? In India, Hindutva is trying to do the same, benchmark, right? Based on some senses ethnic criteria. Sri Lanka, right, went to an horrendous civil war. I'm absolutely glad that it's in some senses it's over, but the underlying issues can rear that head at any time. So the question all of us as South Asians need to be asking is, do we want to remain trapped in a world where each one of us is trapped and benchmarked by our own identities? It's so suffocating. We are not even now talking Hindu versus Muslim. Even Hindus are being benchmarked. What does it mean to be a good Hindu? An absolutely absurd question to ask, right? As if it is anybody else's question to ask. Because those identity traps do not have any solutions within our democratic politics, right? That's option one. Option two is, do you want to imagine or reimagine South Asia as a zone of freedom, right? Where in each of our nation states, there is a fundamental commitment to the dignity of the individual and individual rights. What comes with that dignity is that people will be free to choose whatever identity they wish. We will cherish diversity, not because it is legislated diversity and we are benchmarked to our compulsory identities, but because we are free to create and recreate ourselves whichever way we want. And so the consensus of our politics has to shift from, right, this politics of fear, this backward-looking politics of looking to where we came from, to a politics of hope and a politics of freedom. Right? And my humble submission is, I know my Indian colleagues will resent this fact, but I do not think that the transition to a politics of freedom in South Asia can happen without the region doing it all together. Even one part of our region, India had this illusion. Pakistan can do what it wants. Bangladesh can do what it wants. We will go our merry way. We have a very different constitutional identity. And in some senses, we still do. But our histories are so intertwined, right? The implications of what each of us does to our identity are so intertwined, right? It's like pulling a little thread. If you pull the thread, the whole tapestry begins to unravel. That unless it's a South Asia-wide commitment to saying we need to reset the terms in which our politics was reconstituted. This does not mean giving up on our nation states. This does not mean giving up on protecting our national interests, right? Nepal will be Nepal, Bangladesh will be Bangladesh, Sri Lanka will be Sri Lanka. But it does mean squarely facing the only threat that can keep South Asia apart, which is this, being trapped in these pinched up identities. The irony is we thought South Asia has the youngest population in the world. It would be entering the most creative phase of economy, technology, social change. And yet it is precisely this post-colonial generation that seems to now be besotted with the politics of the 1930s all over again. Okay? And so I'd urge us, all of us, go back, read the politics of the 1930s. What are the mistakes we made? And can we imagine South Asia as a new zone of freedom? Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the wonderful and very comprehensive remark. We have received lots of questions. Around 80 has been sent by my team to me, but
Gosh.
I have no time to it will be very difficult for me to pick one or club together. So without wasting time, let me raise some of the questions. Maybe I'll try to club two at a time. Yeah. So there is increasing conservatism in India since BJP come to power. Similar is the situation in Russia and China. There is rise of Trumpism in America. Is the future of democracy bleak only in South Asia, or is it global phenomenon? And second is current Indian society the byproduct of BJP, or BJP is the byproduct of conservative Indian society?
Okay, so two things. There's a very good question. So first of all, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree that the crisis of democracy is a global crisis. There are local variations. I don't think, for example, Trumpism is exactly the same phenomenon as Hindu nationalism, although there are elements to it. But certainly, if you look at, Eastern Europe, I mean, Erdogan, Turkey, Erdogan, Hungary, Orban, you will find lots of parallels. So it is a crisis in global democracy, and it has common features. I mean, the common features are the implosion of the center, and it is worth asking why that center lost legitimacy, and why it came to be identified with a kind of plutocratic old regime. Happened in kind of all our countries, right? It certainly has to do somewhat with the politics of inequality that expresses itself in new forms of resentment post-financial crisis 2009. But let's make no mistake about it, right? The core danger in almost all of these countries is a virulent form of ethno-nationalism, right? The United States democracy is not out of the woods despite Mr. Biden's victory, right? If anything, the racial polarization could actually get exacerbated. So you're absolutely right. It is a global phenomenon, and I think it bears reflection why we are all regressing to this kind of the world of those closed ethnic identities that we were so trying hard to shake off. We never quite shaken them off, but we were, in some senses. The second part of the question, which I think we have to be a little bit careful about using of the word conservatism. And why I say this is because at one level, if you think like a political party like the BJP, it is actually both conservative and revolutionary at the same time. In the sense that it is embarking on a project that is going to be the most significant reconfiguration of Hinduism. Okay, this is not Hinduism. This is not, it doesn't have an interest in traditional social structures, not really, right? In fact, in some ways, it can actually probably be more amelioratively radical on caste than the Congress party was. Very frankly, let's be very clear about it. Congress was actually a lot more conservative on caste than I think the BJP is in its practice. So it's not conservatism in the sense that it requires the preservation of existing institutions. It is a ethnocratic majoritarianism. It's a reactionary, as it were, modernism, right? It's not conservative, for example, in its use of technology. It's not conservative in its willingness to use the state power, right? To, in some senses, uproot existing traditions and communities and identities in very radical ways, right? And so I think it is important not to misread too much into the word conservatism when actually applied to the BJP. In fact, in some senses, it's probably the most disruptive force that Indian politics has actually seen.
There are lots of questions related to majoritarianism. Like you said that India has become ethno-religious majoritarianism or ethno-nationalism is there. What does it mean? Like what is ethno-religiousism and how is it harmful for any democracy? We have got lots of questions on that. Okay. Similarly, there is a question on democracy by its very nature was built on the concept of a prevailing majority taking precedence.
That's right.
Given this, majoritarianism could be viewed as an inherited quality of a democracy, which inevitably could be taken as a nationalist stance. So by this logic, could majoritarianism be justified since it involves the overwhelming will of the electorate?
Okay, very good questions. And look, I mean, it would take us a whole seminar to unpack a lot of the different meanings of majoritarianism, but I think a short answer for the moment, right, is, of course, you're right. Democracy we often define as majority rule, but remember, even in majority rule, there are checks and balances. There are restraints on what a majority may or may not do to an individual. And we used to think democracies are constitutional representative democracies in which all three words are important, right? Okay. But coming to the specific question, right? So the claim of ethno-nationalism is that in order for a nation to be a nation and successfully be a nation, right, it must be united around one ethnic identity. Okay? And in some senses, the BJP sleight of hand is to re-articulate Hindus as an ethnos. BJP doesn't understand the A of religion. It certainly doesn't understand the ABC of moral or spiritual values or Indian tradition. It has no interest in that other than as a political weapon. Okay. But what it has an interest in saying is that India is a Hindu nation. We will benchmark what identification with this Hindu nation means. And that benchmarking then invariably excludes minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians. Now, formally, the BJP and RSS will say, no, but they are also Hindus, the RSS leader has come out with a statement saying, of course, we want Muslims to be in India, but there's a sting in the tail, right? The sting in the tail is that you will be considered equal citizens only on terms that we set. Okay. Now, this kind of benchmarked majoritarian ethnic identity is profoundly corrosive for democratic values, right? One, it says that if you belong to particular religious communities, you will not be equal participants in the making and remaking of this democracy and this culture, right? Okay. And this is manifest in behavior all over, right? Your patriotism will always be suspect, for example, right? Second, what is fundamentally dangerous about this is that it believes in policing identity. Why is the BJP obsessed with love jihad? Right? Laws to regulate interreligious marriage. Okay. Surely it should be up to the free individuals to decide. It is none of the state's business. Right? Okay. Number three, with this ethno-nationalist identity, almost always comes a stock of deep prejudice. And then frankly, we can talk about the reasons for the rise of the BJP, secularism, pseudo-secularism, Congress's hypocrisy, double standards. But let's be very blunt about it. Like in the 1930s, okay, part of what we are seeing in South Asia, whenever we talk about other ethnic groups, is the injection of sheer prejudice and poison in our civil societies. Okay, and it's a poison that you will not be able to extract back out. So it's majoritarian in all of those ways. It's also bad for Hindus. In fact, it's a disaster for Hinduism. It's a disaster for Hinduism because what it does is it takes away from the organic creativity, right? The civilizational variousness and creativity of this extraordinary tradition, and regiments it into a single political identity, right? The aim of ethnic majoritarianism is that Hindus qua Hindus should rule, and they should rule as Hindus. Okay? So it's extremely corrosive of democracy. Now, as I said, yes, of course, in democracy, majority rule matters, and that's why we have to, find a political answer to this question. It's not going to be pushed back simply by the checks and balances of the state. The BJP has popular support. It would not have risen without popular support. There's no question about it, right? But if the net combination is a conjunction of authoritarianism and communalism, this is a combination we have not seen with the kind of virulence that we are seeing right now in India. 1975, we have authoritarianism in the emergency. India's had patches of communalism. But the idea that both are joined together to be inscribed in the architecture of the state, right? This is relatively new. This is, from the BJP's point of view, furthering the logic of partition.
So we have lots of questions. So let me try to club 3 questions at the moment. How do you look at the role of media and civil society in South Asia for the current state of affairs of democracy in India or in South Asia? Second is, would you like to comment on the impact of the subtle and not so very subtle changes in political landscape of India on other South Asian countries? And third is, when we revisit democracy, we realize that the soul of democracy is dying while the form is getting reconstructed. In observation of International Day of Democracy 2021, what are the ways by which the trust in democracy can be restored? That is the question.
Okay. So look, the media question is a very interesting question. And I'll take it at sort of three different levels. One, and this is a global phenomenon that, particularly with the advent of social media, that, sometimes it feels like we are in a completely new information order whose rules and impact we don't understand. I mean, it's a bit like, maybe printing was in the 15th century, right? Suddenly kind of printing takes hold and, all kinds of Protestant revolutions begin to take place, all kinds of sects emerge, because at one level it's quite empowering, right? You have unmediated access. And, it took a while for the protocols to actually sort of evolve what these forms of communication do to our identity, what these do to forms of mobilization that are actually possible. The asymmetry between truth and doubt, right? In a media environment that's almost kind of so instantaneous, right? So one, I think that's a general problem I think democracies have been facing globally in some senses, that there is a kind of new technology information order whose full dynamics we still don't fully understand. We don't fully understand how it can actually be exploited to generate new kinds of identities and so forth. There's a second level of question, which is at the level of institutional control, where states actively intervene to suppress, right, or control this information order through overt and covert measures. So, for example, with broadcast media in India, frankly, broadcast media in India, there are a couple of channels, I'm sure all of you can name which ones they are, that have almost Goebbelsian dimensions, right? Night after night, all they spew is prejudice and hate mongering, right? This kind of broadcast media, I mean, the only parallels I can think of is, Radio Rwanda, for example, right? Where slowly over time, they begin to legitimize our own worst instincts, right? Now, in the Indian case, I can speak of the Indian case, but maybe there are parallels as well. There's actually a nice alliance between Indian capital, the Indian state, and the Indian media, for the most part, right? After all, the owners of capital, most of the media in India is private media, right? They seem to be quite happy in some senses to help the state control or shape this political environment in new and unprecedented ways. The third thing, which I think is a much harder question, and it goes back to the civil society question that somebody that I think you'd also asked, which is, there are lots of individual journalists. There are lots of brave individuals who are trying to fight back, as always happens in some senses in situations like this. But I think it is a very disturbing question to ask, why aren't there enough of them, right? Is it the case that the media itself, I can speak of the Hindi media, for example, at least the print media in Hindi, where I often get the distinct impression that a large section of the owners of that media are actually quite comfortable with the ideologies they are pushing. That it's not simply opportunism, it's not simply repression by the state, it is actually genuine conversion, where the elites of a country decide, right, that they are actually comfortable pushing this agenda which marginalizes 20% of the population or something out, right? What can we do for International Democracy Day? If you're in a situation like the 1920s and 30s, the only thing you can hope is, at least countries like India will need something akin to a second freedom struggle. You need politics at two levels. We, of course, need to play electoral politics very smartly. And unfortunately for us, our opposition and political class still do not seem to realize the existential gravity of the situation, right? I mean, Congress party can't even, hold on to the two states it has. It's infighting. I mean, it's extraordinary, right? So you have to be politically savvy. And look, the old iron law of Indian politics is the index of opposition unity is 1, and it's a credible index. It's a credible unity. Then the BJP can still be pushed back. That's that's going to be harder to achieve. It's easier said than done. But at a political level, that's the case. But at a much more deeper level, right? If part of what I've been saying is correct, then I think we need to ask very difficult questions of ourselves as citizens. These conflicts that I'm talking about are now running within families in India. What have we done to ourselves to legitimize a politics of fear and hate? What have we done to ourselves that we are actually quite comfortable with forms of authoritarianism? Maybe it's the illusion that neither of them is going to affect us, right? I mean, that's the privilege of majoritarianism. 80% of the population is not going to be affected by communalism. Minorities are going to bear the brunt of this, right? It feels that way. Similarly with authoritarianism, right? First they'll come for the Naxals, then they'll come for the dissenters. Finally, no one left to speak for me. So I do think there is an extraordinary moral and spiritual crisis in our democracies as well, for which we as citizens need to think much, much more deeply about.
So we still have 50 questions. We are running out of time, so maybe we can request you for another 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Let me have first three questions. Like, given the strong religious nature of South Asians, do you think that politics can be separated from religion or other identity traps? Another is on Afghanistan. Like, how will Taliban's victory in Afghanistan affect democratic societies in South Asia? And does COVID pandemic expose our limitations of the democratic system?
Okay. Very big questions, very good one. So the first question, right? Of course, religion is important in South Asia. And not just important, extraordinarily important. In fact, in global terms, South Asia is now an outlier, actually. Religion is on the decline, even in the United States, if you at least to believe the New World Values Survey. And that's perfectly fine. Look, religion is a source of our civilizational creativity. There's no question about it. I mean, we can't, sort of turn back. But the one mistake we make, right, and this is true again across all South Asian countries, is to conclude that because religion is important in South Asian identities, politics, and life, therefore we don't need to be secular states, or therefore secularism can't survive. In fact, the argument is the opposite. It's precisely because religion is so important, and it's precisely because we value religion, right, that in some senses you need to separate the basic constitutional essentials of a state and particular religious identities. Why do you need to do that? Number one, you need to do that so that you can treat all religions equally. Okay, that's point number one. So if you want to avoid religious conflict in conditions where religion is terribly important, it's important that the state, in some senses, be just towards all. It is not seen as a state that targets some groups for being who they are, that targets particular religions, right? So that's a basic, let's call it the peace reason, okay? There's a second reason, second religious reason why you need to keep the state out of politics. Is, yes, we are all religious, but we also differ over how we should be religious within our own religions. The deep fissures in South Asia are not just between religious communities, they are running within every religious communities, right? Should women be allowed entry into temples? Should women priests be appointed, right? Should Sharia be reformed in a particular way? All of these questions are questions that members of particular religious groups are asking of their own religions, right? Now, I'll use my favorite example. I've used this many times, but I think it's so simple that, hopefully we can get a consensus on it. Every time I meet a group of Indian MPs from different parties, they will always say this, South Asia is different. Western secularism can't work here. Liberalism can't work here. Individual rights is a Western concept, right? I'm sure all of you have heard this in your countries, right? right? We are sui generis, we are, right? Let me ask you one very simple question. Each of us, as citizens of South Asia, members of particular religious groups, communities, ethnicities, linguistic groups, we resent when some other group imposes something upon us, right? Muslims will resent if Hindus impose something on them. Hindus resent if Muslims impose something on us, right? I mean, it's a very common experience, right? Tamils will resent if Sinhalas impose something on them, right? I mean, this very common experience that each of us resents impositions, right? We like to say that something is legitimate for us only if it has our consent, right? We use these arguments all the time. Minorities use it against majorities. Please don't impose your majority view on us, right? Now, all you have to do to imagine liberalism and secularism is to extend that courtesy to every single individual. When somebody in your community says to the Orthodox, please don't impose your view on me, they are asking exactly the same right that Orthodox person is asking when he asks members of some other group not to impose their views on them, right? So, in fact, the only way in which you can have a just society is by guaranteeing everybody their individual rights. And if that is the case, a much more authentic religion will flourish because it will be freely chosen. It will be freely embraced, right? So my worry about mixing religion and politics is it destroys religion actually more than it will destroy politics. So just extend that basic courtesy to everybody that we ourselves demand, right? Nepal might resent India imposing something on it, and rightly. But if the moral objection is that we should not impose something somebody does not consent to, just extend it to individuals within your groups as well. So lots of different interpretations will flourish. That was always the creative dynamism of South Asia, right? Which we now want to regiment in a system of power. Okay. So that's kind of, I think, broadly on the religion question. Sorry, I missed the last question.
Last was in Taliban's victory in Afghanistan.
Yes, sorry, the Afghanistan. Yeah, no. So look, this is very bad news for the subcontinent. Okay, and it's bad news in the following way. Of course, it's bad news for Afghanistan. Now, who are we to say what's good or bad news for Afghanistan, given what that country has had to endure over the last 20, 25 years? But it is bad news because, one, in the near term, certainly the conflict is going to deepen and exacerbate it. We have no idea what Afghanistan will settle into, right? Will it look like Saudi Arabia in the 1990s? Will it be much more anarchic? Who knows, right? But the one thing that I think is important for South Asia, and this is particularly the western part of South Asia, right, is, any society in which there is a proliferation of arms and a legitimization of violence under whatever pretext finds it very, very difficult to emerge as a peaceful society. Okay? And I think the use of and legitimization of terror, para-state actors, militias that we have flooded that part of the subcontinent with, that's going to be a challenge for pretty much all of us. I mean, even if tomorrow the governments decide, why are ethnic wars so enduring? It's the one lesson we should learn from the 20th century. Was even the smallest group that you arm, the smallest militia that you arm, can threaten peace in ways nobody anticipated. So it's terrible news at the level of violence. It's certainly going to embolden fundamentalists. It's another kind of rallying point in some senses. it's also going to have perverse effects. Even if the Taliban doesn't plan to act outside of Afghanistan, even if it says, we are an Afghan national force, we have no transnational interests. Let's say, for argument's sake, even if they said that, although it's unlikely given what we are seeing in the last 2 to 3 days, it's connected to the Haqqani network, it's connected to groups inside Pakistan, it's who knows, right? But even if it were to say that, right, it will be put to ideological use. Hindu nationalism, for example, will clearly say, look, I mean, here's a new threat we face. For this, we need to consolidate, right? A much stronger sort of, Hindu political identity in some ways. Look, minorities have again been cleansed out of Afghanistan. So the discursive uses of the presence of Taliban, right, just like the discursive uses of the presence of 9/11, created a whole sort of overreaction infrastructure. That's also probably going to, in some ways, happen. And I think the fact, look, this is fundamentally the fact we are skirting around, that unless the countries of South Asia, all of them learn to cooperate and be on the same page on some basic political values, commitment to pacification of violence, right? Okay, that's in the interest of all our states. Because the one thing we've learned from the 20th century, you let loose any forms of legitimation of violence in the name of, religion or ethno-nationalism, it will come back to haunt you. Okay. So insofar as I think we are going through that cycle of legitimizing this all over again, it's bad news for South Asia.
So we have lots of questions on the impact of COVID pandemic on democratic systems. And last question, like, given the growing number of youths in India today, who holds progressive, secular and liberal views, could they play a role in altering the future of democracy in India? Maybe we should.
Okay. Yeah. So good. So look, the COVID question is a difficult one to answer, because one of the things I think we've learned over the last 2 years is that, every country has declared premature victory only to find out that it hadn't quite done its job, right? I mean, last year we were praising, Thailand and East Asia and Taiwan. Look at the surges there. New Zealand is now really struggling with vaccination. India's initial response to the second wave was much poorer than it should be, but keep our fingers crossed. I mean, if India is now reaching, 8 to 10 million vaccines a day, who knows how this will actually sort of work out. But I think the two things the pandemic has unequivocally exposed, I mean, I think this really just kind of goes without saying in some ways, is one is it has exposed all existing fault lines in our societies. So in India, for example, it has exposed how unequal Indian society was. And keeping our fingers crossed, if India does well with its vaccination drive and the third wave really isn't as bad as some people fear it might be, maybe we won't feel sort of so catastrophically about the government's performance. But the fact of the matter is the brunt of the costs of the pandemic have fallen on the poor. They've fallen on the migrant labor. More people have fallen out of poverty. There is a shrinking of jobs, particularly the lower end of the economic spectrum. So the fear that the pandemic, in some senses, exacerbates existing inequality, I think that is probably true of almost all of our countries. The impact it's going to have on education, right? I mean, Indian kids are just returning to school, barely. We haven't, right, opened schools for, again, the top 20-30% will be fine because they've had access to smartphones, they've had at least some home support. But those at the bottom 20-30% are literally in the danger of dropping out of the system altogether, right? So I think the biggest impact is the way in which it has kind of exposed an existing fault. It did not create this inequality, but it has in some senses exacerbated its effects. But the long-term political impact, to be honest, in India will turn on, how this vaccination drive works and how significant the third way is. The youth and the way forward. Look, at one level, the young of South Asia should be a source of strength. They are way more creative than our generation was. I mean, we've left such a mess for them that we have no locus standi. We shouldn't be telling them what to be doing. But I think the young are having a much more complicated time channeling their political views and identities, right? Because the existing political structures don't cater to them in some ways. I also think we should not be too complacent. 15, 20 years ago, when we used to kind of meet in South Asia Forum, and we always used to say, look, we finally will have a post-colonial generation, right? Born in the 21st century. It doesn't remember anything of those resentments that have constituted the identities of South Asians for the last 70 years, right? How spectacularly wrong we were. The ability of new political forces to, tap into the younger generation. And in some senses, they now remember it more virulently because it's more abstract to them, right? In some ways. So I think we have to do a lot of political work. I think there's a potential there, absolutely. But somebody will have to do the political work to capitalize on it and channelize it.
Thank you, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion and valuable time. It was great learning experience. We still have more than 50 questions, but due to time constraint, we have to end it here. I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from the lecture. We hope to have you again in future, maybe in Nepal when things get normal. We'd also like to thank all our audience for their participation and wonderful question. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.